Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I'm so glad that you could be with us for this very important April Alcohol Awareness Month event. We're going to hear an honest, vulnerable, inspiring story from Dr. Carl Fisher with some history, well-researched history about addiction, and some takeaways that can make a difference in our families. So I'm very, very glad you're here for this important conversation. We're very grateful to you for your time and trust, and the time and trust and kindness and generosity of our sponsors as well, who make this all possible. If you go to glenbardgps.org, just like the slide that you saw a minute ago, you can see all of the people that make this possible. We couldn't do it without them and without you. Please do know that the Glenbard Parent Series is for families everywhere. We have programming for even the very youngest parents of young children, several different languages. So do share on social media if you're on social media, and let family and friends know around the country or around the block that everybody's welcome here. So thank you for that. Before we begin our important program, let me tell you about some of the events that we have scheduled to conclude this year. Next week, we will be welcoming back Phyllis Fagel. Phyllis is a true expert in middle school. She has a new book out called Middle School Superpowers. And anybody who's heard Phyllis knows that this truly is not just targeted at that middle school parents, but families of younger children and families of high school students will really learn lots of information at that program. So I hope you'll join us. The 12 strategies to reframe setbacks and gain confidence. We are welcoming back, never done it before, in the very same year, we're welcoming back Anna Lemke, a colleague. Dr. Fisher can tell you all about her. She is the author of the book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. That is a program we just added. It will be on Thursday, May 18th at noon. I hope you'll share that resource. And then we are partnering with the Glen Ellen Public Library. My Sister Liv is a documentary about the tragedy of teen suicide. And there'll be a conversation afterwards that happens on Saturday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Registration is required. Lots of wonderful things are planned for next year. They're already up on the website. I hope you'll take a look and circle your calendar. And now let's get ready for some really important information that will really make a difference in our communities. Introducing tonight is Jordan Pohl. Jordan is Dean of Students at Glenbard West. Next year, he will be the principal at Direction School. Without further ado, Jordan, please take it away.
Well, I'm very excited to be here tonight introducing Dr. Carl Erik Fisher, who is an addiction psychiatrist, bioethics scholar, author, and person in recovery. He's an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, where he studies and teaches law, ethics, and policy relating to psychiatry and neuroscience, especially issues related to substance use disorders and other addictive behaviors. He also maintains a private clinical practice focused on complementary and integrative approaches to addiction and recovery. Dr. Fisher is the author of the nonfiction book, The Urge, Our History of Addiction, named one of the best books of the year by the New Yorker and the Boston Globe. The Urge is an intellectual and cultural history of addiction interwoven with his own experiences as an addiction psychiatrist at Columbia and as someone in recovery himself. He belongs to Columbia University's Science Writing Collective, and he has worked as a screenwriting consultant to the American Film Institute as a Sloan Science mentor. His clinical work focuses on applications of meditation and mindfulness, especially techniques arising from the Buddhist and yogic traditions. He is a Zen practitioner and completed yoga teacher, and we are delighted to welcome him here today to the Glenbard Parent Series. Dr. Fisher.
All right, thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you, Glenda. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you about a topic that's so near and dear to my heart, and something that's unfortunately increasingly important to our nation and to our communities. I'm glad to be here for Alcohol Awareness Month. I think it's important to take time and recognize the effect that alcohol and all drugs have on healthy development, our lives. It certainly touched my life. This is just an honor to be at an educational institution and to have this opportunity. I mentioned earlier, my own mother was a special education teacher. And so I've grown up with a lot of exposure to the importance of just thinking about education across the entire spectrum and how to communicate effectively about healthy parenting and healthy habits. And for me, making sense of addiction, making sense of substance use is an important part of that conversation, because it really is a conversation about what makes us human and problems that are inherent to all of us. It's a major message of what I want to share today, is that I'm talking a little bit about addiction. I'm talking about my own personal experience, but I don't think that there's a truly natural and stark dividing line between addiction and the rest of the population. It's something that there's a little bit of in all of us. That's my experience. That's what I've learned, and that's what I've seen, both from looking at today's modern research and at the history. So I'm really happy to be here. Like you heard in the introduction, I'm a clinician and a scholar and a person in addiction recovery myself. And so a lot of my work, especially this book, has been about trying to integrate those three parts of myself and to make sense of addiction, to make sense of what I saw growing up as the child of two addicted parents. Both of my parents had serious problems with alcoholism. And another key message that I just want to frame at the outset is that I think our ideas about addiction and our ideas about substance use itself are important. So the ideas themselves have tremendous power. They can influence the way that we access help and the way that we talk to each other and the way we even treat ourselves, or how much self-compassion we give ourselves, and how willing we are to even face up to the problems we might be having. So, this is a topic that people discuss in a lot of different ways. Stigma is one label for it. There's a lot of talk about stigma in addiction and mental health. Stigma causes people to suffer in silence. It affects our institutions. It makes it difficult sometimes to access care. Sometimes the way that systems and hospitals and treatment centers seem set up in a way that seems to reinforce external stigma to make it difficult for people. And there's also internal stigma. There's stigma that we direct toward ourselves about the way we think about addiction. And I think that changing stigma changes lives. I think it changes lives and it saves lives. And that's the bottom line why I'm here today. So I'm here to speak about my own story of addiction, how I experienced it, and a little bit about my explorations in scholarly work too. My work to make sense of addiction, primarily for myself, to write the book that I myself felt like I needed to read, and that what I felt I wanted to learn about how people enter recovery and how people grow and change across the whole spectrum of substance use problems, and not just those at the farthest extremes. So I have a few slides, but before I jump into it, I want to talk more directly about some just the brass tacks, some of the bottom line truths of what we are going through as a country right now. You've probably heard about the opioid overdose crisis and other addiction crises that we face. And I like to begin with some very basic statistics, just to try to start to wrap our arms around the enormity of the problem. You may have heard that the number of overdose deaths has risen year on year on year. So as of now, it's over 100,000 deaths per year. That means that almost 300 people die of an overdose per day. That means more than 12 people die each hour. That means that every 5 minutes, somebody dies. So already we're about 10 minutes into this program tonight. That means that 2 people have died of an overdose since the Zoom started and we all logged on. And that's a staggering number when you think about that pace, that rate, and especially that rate is continually increasing. It's gotten significantly worse since COVID. There's no reason to think, unfortunately, that it's that we're bending the curve anytime soon. And the fact that I think gets missed in that statistic is that's only deaths. There are over 40 million people in the US who qualify for a substance use disorder. That's almost 15% of the US population. A huge number of those folks won't get help, and a huge number of people don't think that they need help. And in fact, over 95% of people in some studies who have a substance use disorder don't think they need help and don't get help. So I was one of those people in the greater than 95% who were essentially in denial, and in some ways were hopeless. And so it's my hope that to share a little bit about the actual personal experience, and to talk a little bit about how addiction manifests is a way of helping people to find some hope, helping people to grasp the enormity of what we're facing, and to get a little clearer on what we're going through. So on that note, let me just jump into my personal story. And I do want to make sure I leave a lot of time for question and answer and for discussion. I know there'll be a lot of thoughts, personal experiences, practical questions. And I think the history matters. You know, the history was very important for me in terms of how I made sense of my identity, and how I, in a way, even in early recovery, came to accept the substance use problems I was facing, to make sense of it, and to find some sense of fellowship and connection with other people, because so many people suffer in silence. So, you know, we'll definitely talk a little bit about selected topics in the history that seem useful, that I hope are useful, but really I want to have this be interactive too. So I'm going to make sure that I go pretty swiftly and I stop with enough time to talk. But so in terms of my own personal story, let me just jump into that. I mean, there's so many places I could start. I could start in Bellevue Hospital. It is one of New York City's most notorious public hospitals, where I was taken as a patient at the height of my addiction crisis. Actually, just a year after I had interviewed there for a residency position in the NYU psychiatry department. I could start in my own childhood, when I was coming to terms and coming to understand that both of my parents had severe addiction problems. But really, for our purposes, I think there's no better place to start than my first year becoming a doctor. Right after I graduated med school, during the intern year, when I was working at Columbia University Medical Center. I had always been a drinker. I had experienced problems from drinking, but it was around this time in my first year of being a doctor that I realized that things were really going poorly. My eye would twitch if I went too long between drinks, and I noticed that I had to drink even when I didn't want to. I had to drink to settle my body, and if I didn't have a drink, I would have trouble sleeping. And even I started to have blackouts where one moment I'd just be sitting there, say on the couch watching TV, and the next moment a curtain would descend, and then I would wake up the next morning panicked, late, rushing uptown, trying to wash the smell of alcohol off of me and to mask the signs of really what was increasing dysfunction. And all that was notable because at the time I was caring for people like me. I was seeing an enormous toll of alcohol in my clinical work in the emergency room, and then in the specialized psychiatric emergency room where we take care of people with mental health crises, people who are vomiting blood because of esophageal tears, people who had pancreatitis, where their pancreas and digestive enzymes just give out because of the sheer volume of alcohol that they're taking in. And then people in florid, life-threatening withdrawal, people whose bodies had become so accustomed to alcohol that not only could they not sleep at night or settle, but that they would develop tremors and shakes and even life-threatening seizures if they went too long in between drinks. One of the things I remember the most about that time was not even so much the sights or the sounds of the chaos of the emergency room, but the smells. And the people who had alcohol problems had a stale swell about them. It was something to do with poor hygiene and malnutrition in some cases, but it smelled like alcohol coming through their sweat. And I was really sensitive to this because on bad days, I felt like I could smell it on myself too. And I was writing about it in my journal, and I was asking for help in my seeking out psychotherapies. And setting countless resolutions to myself. But really, I realized that I was one of the 10 to 12% of physicians who have a problem with substance use disorders. And so that's really not too far off the general population. And it just goes to show that substance use problems cut across all dimensions, that really there are ways that people can be insulated. It is not purely equal opportunity to have problems with substance use disorders, but really it pervades everywhere. And so if 10 to 12% of physicians have some history with a substance use disorder, what does that say to you? How many people do you know who share about this type of thing, who speak about it openly? There are a few others. There are a couple who have written books. I'm by no means special or unique in that sense, but hardly any, really. And it just goes to show, I think, the way that it's still in 2023 stigmatized and a difficult thing to share about. And an important point about this time in my life is that I really got good help. That I got to the point of an intervention at my residency program. I remember being called into my residency director's office, and this was a faculty member I had known for years and years and years. And I went to medical school at Columbia, and then I did a research fellowship in the psychiatry department, and then I stayed on for residency. So I really had deep relationships with a number of the folks there. And I trusted my residency director, and I trusted some of her staff who were there that day. But still, when I walked into her office and I saw that it wasn't just her, but it was her assistant and then one of the chief residents, I just knew that I had to face reality. And the way that they spoke to me, it couldn't have been better or more compassionate. They were very thoughtful and caring, and very, very were just painstaking in the way that they reinforced the idea that I wasn't in trouble. Carl, we know that something is up, but we really want to emphasize that everything is okay. You can get confidential help, and there's services available. You're not alone in this. And I trusted everything they were saying on face value. I knew that, there was a confidential counseling service attached to the psychiatry department. It wouldn't mean that I would just get summarily fired. But still, I felt denial rise up in me. And this is the point that I really want to emphasize, is that it really was not rational. It wasn't about making a choice. It was at that moment, I felt like I would die if I admitted the truth. If I said I had problems, if I said I've been struggling to control my alcohol use, or even if I had just gone to some sort of referral there, it felt like it would require a sort of different version of myself in my life, to the point where it felt like a kind of death. And what I think that's about, it really is almost like a visceral feeling. It's not a logical thing that happened. But to me, what it means is that I just couldn't square the notion that I was a person that had a problem with substances. To me, people with addiction problems, with substance use problems, with alcohol problems, were people who were sick. There were people like my parents. They were the sick ones. I was the healthy one. They were the abnormal ones. I was the normal one. And so I lied. I just said, I know what this looks like, but I promise you, I'm getting help, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And all that was a lie. It was just, I knew what I had to say in order to get out of that office. And so instead of getting help, what I did is I got Adderall. And that was connected to a different aspect of my addiction, because I mentioned before, I think addiction is really something that's part of the human condition, at least in the sense that there's always a way that people are striving for attachment, striving for a way of working with our pain. In research, they call this a concept called psychological flexibility or inflexibility. It's a natural and normal human response. There's nothing to be ashamed of to try to control our experiences or try to escape pain. But the problem is the tricks that we come up with internally and linguistically and otherwise get us into more trouble than they're worth. And control becomes the problem, not the solution. And I was trying to control my alcohol use, but I was also trying to control myself, like I was a sort of machine, and just focused on academic achievement and distinguishing myself above all else. I needed to be at the top to feel good about myself. I needed attention, validation, and praise. And even when that meant that I had to take alcohol to calm down in the evening and Adderall to wake up in the morning and to be going and firing on all cylinders at all times. I went into a doctor's office, actually a friend of a friend in New York City, and said, hey, listen, I know it's an off-label use, but I could really use some Adderall because I'm feeling tired and I'm trying to put out these academic papers and get ahead in my scholarly career. And he said, okay, be careful, but no problem. Wrote me the prescription. And even at that moment, I knew it was leading me in a bad direction. I knew that in a way my values were misaligned, not in a sort of shameful, I was a bad person way, but just that psychological health is about also being in line with our authentic values as a human being. And I knew that this path was not leading me in a good direction, that I was striving after something that didn't lead to actual satisfaction, and still I felt compelled to do that. At first, actually, this worked. It worked in the sense that people take drugs for reasons. There's always a reason behind the drugs that we're using, and the Adderall was a good compensation. My drinking got slightly better at first. I could actually compensate for hangovers in the morning, and I felt for a moment like I could control my ups and control my downs in a more effective way. The drinking crept back in after a time, but then I used Adderall to compensate, and it worked until it didn't. And then I got to a vacation where I went on a full-on binge, and then eventually started using cocaine. And just by the end of a 2-week vacation, I was fully manic. I was in a manic episode in the way that people who have, say, bipolar disorder get manic. I had too much energy. I couldn't sleep at night, even without drugs. I had delusional thinking, thinking that I was in some sort of spiritual awakening and beset by evil forces. And it was a full-on crisis. It was a true crisis. So I don't like to linger too long on the war stories, or sort of the worst of it, because I think you've heard versions of that before, perhaps, and it's not all that necessary, other than to say that in my case, I had a seizure. I went to one hospital first, and then I checked myself out again because I didn't want to be sick, and I thought I could manage it all by myself. And eventually wound up in Bellevue Hospital, where I got treated by some really lovely physicians, some of whom that I had met when I was on the interview trail trying to get a psychiatry position. And I was referred to a specialized rehab for doctors. And even then, I had resistance. Even then, after I had an alcohol-related seizure and was brought in by the NYPD in a full-on crisis, I said, this isn't me. This can't possibly be who I am. This doesn't square with the vision I had for myself. And I just had the urgent sense that, maybe there's a way I can get out of this, or maybe there's a way I can sort of leave the program. And another important piece about this is that I was reacting to real problems. And I think if you've seen people who have gone to, say, a wilderness program or to a rehab center, or you've heard about people who've had bad experiences with psychiatrists or with psychotherapy or in some sort of substance-related treatment facility, that we have real problems in the United States. And that's, I don't have time to get into that, but I'm happy to talk more about some of the historical legacies and why it wound up that way. I mean, really, the upshot is that the American medical profession, for various reasons, basically abandoned the treatment of addiction in the earlier part of the 20th century because of the deep-seated stigma and shame and blame attached to the condition. And so we treat it unlike any other mental problems. And so I was reacting to real problems that I saw, that there was some people at the rehab who were overly confrontational and treated it sort of like a boot camp. And what we know from the best psychological research today is that those types of tough love, aggressive, punitive approaches are not pragmatic. They don't actually work for our desired ends. That they promote resistance. And we know that from key studies in a type of interviewing called motivational interviewing, and many other studies since then. That everybody has a righting reflex. If you tell somebody this is what you should be doing, we can't resist it. Our brains naturally come up with a counter argument. We're already inventing, even unconsciously, a sort of different response. And so it's easy to say, but it's not easy to do in practice. We have to find ways of engaging with people that support their own self-efficacy without playing some sort of wannabe reverse psychology game of leading them to the conclusion that we think they should have, but just to tap into their own sense of self-efficacy and ask them questions in a way that helps them to think through what their own resources are and what their own internal wisdom leads them to. So my experience was, it was meeting with the people who were less confrontational, who were more compassionate, who met me in that more self-efficacy promoting way. And then also just meeting other people who had substance problems, other doctors, other clinicians who also had substance problems, which really was just an antidote to shame. It helped me to be seen and to realize that I was okay. And the fact that I struggled with alcohol didn't mean that I was a bad person, and that those human connections showed me that I could change, and I could get better. And so just in the brief time I have left, I want to say a little bit about what I described about the book project, and just a few selected tidbits from the history that I thought might be useful or help to stimulate discussion. And again, I just want to say, and I'll remind you a couple of times more, that I'd love to have discussion and questions. I already see a little notification down in the chat that people are starting to write in, and that's great. And so please think of your questions, and I look forward to question and discussion. So I hope somebody tells me if the screen sharing is not working, but it looks like it's working all right for me. This is the hospital where I worked at Columbia University Medical Center, and when I went back to work, and once I was relatively stable, I had this sense that I wasn't going to relapse anytime in the near future, and that I was pretty safe. But I still had this big driving question: what had gone wrong in me? Like, what actually led to this problem? And what that led me to think about is the history, precisely because, I thought I was well situated to understand the science, and the science has a lot to show us. It's really helpful in terms of designing effective treatments and thinking through how to design treatment programs. But the truth of the matter is nobody has a really comprehensive and neat and tidy explanation for what addiction is, at least not in a way that helped me personally to think, okay, this is who I am. I wanted one neat and tidy theory of addiction. I read the neuroscience and the genetics and all the rest. And instead of one neat, tidy theory of addiction, there were 30 theories of addiction. There's a book called Theories of Addiction, written by one of the leading United Kingdom researchers, and it categorizes 30 different explanations, and all of them are pretty good, but they capture one piece of the puzzle. What I wanted was something more comprehensive that got at the phenomenon at the core of human experience. Like, how did this happen to me? How did my choices go awry? And just to tell you the point before I get into the examples, the two of the most important lessons that I got is that there's addiction in all of us, and that there are many different pathways to recovery, by which I mean many different pathways to change. And about this first point, the problems of addiction and substance use problems are generally presented as if there's a sort of either or, yes, no binary, that either you're sort of hijacked and compelled, or you're normal. And I think this is a really misleading idea, precisely because from my experience and my patients' experience, usually it's not that you're taken over like a zombie. It's that choice goes awry, that people make difficult choices in a way that the choice is disordered, but it still feels like making a choice. And people have been interested in all of Western philosophy. Aristotle was deeply, deeply interested in what he called akrasia, which is a phenomenon that's sometimes translated as weakness of will, but also sometimes translated as incontinence, which I think is an evocative term. It's a phenomenon of doing something even though you truly believe it would be better not to do it. So recognizing in the moment that you're acting against your better judgment. So it's not just saying like, oh, it would be better if I didn't drink, it's better for my health. It's saying my better judgment says, I do not want to drink. This is not what I want to do. My true intention is not to drink, and still watching myself walk to the corner store and buy alcohol and violate my intentions. And this was important to Aristotle, not as a sort of isolated little extreme of the human experience, but as something universal in human life, and something that was universally relevant to practical ethics. Ethics not in the sense of shaming people, but in the sense of inquiring into what makes a good life, and how do I live a life aligned to the true highest good. And contemporary philosophers have translated this and talked about it in ways that I think are pretty immediately recognizable. Here's a summary from Fred Mele. I decided to take a month off after dinner snacks, and then around the 15th, my resolve starts to waver, and I see a slice of pie in the fridge. I recognize I'm feeling tempted, so I remind myself of my resolution, and I tell myself it would be best not to eat it. And then even as I'm telling myself it's a bad idea, I calmly take it out, carry it to the table, and proceed to eat the pie. So clear-eyed with the idea that this is not what I want, this is not what I intend to do, and still I watch myself doing the thing. This is the real mystery of addiction for me, and I think it's a mystery of human life. Addiction is an extreme. Drugs are stronger than sugar. Drugs are strong. Drugs, including alcohol, I should say, because alcohol is a drug. Drugs are stronger than maybe some other behavioral experiences that we can call addictive, like smartphone use or video gaming. What's different in addiction is that it's not that it's a different subset of human experience, or it's something neatly divisible from the rest of humankind, but it's a stronger disordered choice. It's powerfully influenced by learning and by pain, but it's not a separate state of humanity. And that's the thing I see repeated over and over in the history, and also in the more contemporary research. And so there's a lot of fellowship to be found here, excuse me, in the history that I looked for examples of addiction even before we had a name for it, and I found an example in ancient Sanskrit hymns in the Rig Veda from 1000 BC. And there's a beautiful poem called The Gambler's Lament, that describes a man's descent into gambling addiction. And it's a beautiful, long, evocative poem, and I'll just say a bit of it, that it describes how the gambler goes to the hall of play asking himself, will I win? Puffing himself up with, I will win. And so we already see that there's internal conflict there, and some internally motivated aspect of denial. And then the dice run counter to his desire. The winning throws go to his opponent, and then so the dice acquire their own power, or their own agency. That the dice themselves are hooking, goading, debasing, scorching, seeking to scorch. And so what this shows is the push and the pull, and the battle of the divide itself. And it also shows that it's not just about the drug. That addiction exists in all of us, and of course, gambling is a really powerful addiction. And despite the fact that it's not related to a specific substance, it's a serious addiction. In fact, in some research, it has the highest rate of suicide. 1 in 5 people, according to some studies, who have a true gambling disorder attempt suicide. That's 15 times higher than the general population. So a really severe malady. But also it shows that it's just a learning process. It's about basic rewards and punishments, and addiction is not properly found in the object. Addiction is not found in the substance. It's the way that we humans interact with an addictive behavior. What that shows to me is that addiction is in all of us, and that helps me to break down this division between us and them, and make peace with the identity of somebody who has had problems with substances. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over briefly, and maybe we can come back to this, but I did want to mention, because we're in Alcohol Awareness Month, and this is a topic about alcohol, that the United States has had many epidemics. That was one of the big surprises in my book, that we had an opioid epidemic back in the mid-19th century, around the time of the Civil War, and other waves of epidemics. And in the earlier part of the American history, we had an alcohol epidemic. And this was described by foreign observers and some of the founding fathers. There was a huge spike in alcohol consumption in the early years after the Revolutionary War. People drank 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year per capita. That's more than 4 standard drinks a day for all adults, and that's 3 times today's figures, which are already huge. And also women drank a lot less, and there were a lot of folks who didn't have the power or the agency or the basic human rights to be able to drink, such as slaves. So people drank a tremendous amount. The actual numbers for people who are drinkers is much higher than those 4 standard drinks a day. People drank alcohol in the morning rather than coffee to wake up. They drank at the 11s, which is at 11 a.m., and then they drank again at lunch, and then they drank in the afternoon. It was just an enormous parade of alcohol. And this was noted by a lot of contemporary observers as well. I'll skip ahead a little bit just to say that there are many different pathways that societies have sought to address alcohol problems. And that squares with the notion that the individuals follow many different pathways. That back then there was a mutual help group that's really analogous to Alcoholics Anonymous, even though there's no actual historical connection there. It was called the Washingtonians. It started in the 1840s, and then later on, Abraham Lincoln gave some speeches acknowledging how influential they were and how useful they were. People took an abstinence pledge, and at certain points, up to 1/10 of certain cities took those pledges. I think this is something that we've progressively lost and found in different eras of history, that there are many different pathways for people to get better. Unfortunately, in a lot of our addiction treatment system, it can seem one size fits all, like everybody does the same old stuff. And if I'm not severely suffering, then why should I go to therapy, or why should I seek for help? If I'm not an alcoholic, then maybe I just need to toughen up in a way. And I think that's really misleading, because there's a huge and broad spectrum of human diversity when it comes to the way we interact with rewards and with pleasures and with pains. I just said before that there are tens of millions of people in the United States that qualify for a substance use disorder. But there are tens of millions of people who have also resolved the problem with drugs, including alcohol, that over 22 million by some standards, by some recent surveys have resolved the problem. And about half of those folks identify with the label of being in recovery. I'm one of those people, but not everyone does. They find different pathways. And even fewer of those identify as someone who's a member of a 12-step group. People recover from serious substance problems in a variety of ways. People recover from mild alcohol problems or mild substance problems in a variety of ways. And unfortunately, this is something that we have not done as good of a job in science and addiction research. We're very, very good at going to the absolute worst outcomes and helping people who are in extremis. But it's really only in recent history, 5, 10, 15 years, that there's been some really intensive and excellent research on that whole spectrum, what some alcohol researchers call the underserved majority, that the majority of people are sort of in the middle of the bell curve, where they have some problems, but it doesn't rise to the level of sort of the stereotypical full-blown addiction. And just finally, to bring it back to the present, I just want to put up a slide that I saw just a couple of weeks ago at the American Society of Addiction Medicine conference in Washington, D.C., where some people from the Centers for Disease Control and other national institutes were presenting national data about alcohol problems. And it's just getting worse during COVID. I think all of us, still, despite the fact that a lot seems back to normal, there's still a way that COVID and the after effects have caused some dislocation and some alienation, and we've seen a tremendous rise in all the indicators and rates of substance use and rates of substance-related consequences and the number of cigarette packets sold. This is a graph that shows the change from 2019 to 2020, and you can see how the graphs are filling in here. This is alcohol-related liver disease, so people's organs are literally giving out because of the higher rate of alcohol. And finally, I'll just, again, in the interest of time, and I'll remind you again, I'd love to have questions and discussion and to hear from you and hear about what matters most to you. But I just wanted to say that my good friend and a very good and very even-handed journalist, Tim Reckbarth, who is also a professor at NYU, wrote a wonderful story just a couple of days ago, April 23rd. I could do a whole talk just on this topic, how we decided alcohol was the health boon, how we decided that alcohol was healthy, maybe it was good for your heart, et cetera. And that all fell apart. And many of you have probably seen that Canada has just reversed their guidance and said that alcohol is not healthy, and that the healthy amount of alcohol to drink is 0 drops. That, you know, it's not something to be shameful or prohibitionist about. There's no, you know, there's no fantasy that we're going to abolish alcohol from the face of the earth, but just to recognize, to come to reality that alcohol is a drug and that it has significant health effects. And part of the reason that happened was because of big alcohol's involvement, that the alcohol industry has a tremendous vested interest in not just the messaging it uses, but in trying to shape the science and shape people's thoughts. So, you know, I have some thoughts about takeaways and lessons for today about alcohol and otherwise, but really I just want to hear from you. And I'd like to open this up and to hear your questions and your comments. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about such an important topic, and look forward to hearing what you have to say and your questions.
And they're coming in. Many people thanking you for your open and candid and honest conversation. Let's start off with a question from Jordan. Jordan, if you'll turn on your camera. Hi,
Dr. Fisher. Thank you for sharing all that and for being so open, like Gilda said. Working with our high school students and talking to them about some of the struggles they have. I'm curious if you have any advice for some of our young people who are just starting to feel a reliance on drugs or alcohol. I think I hear from certain students that they get worried that they need certain substances to fall asleep at night or to interact socially. And I'm just curious your thoughts on something we can say to these students who are feeling the early stages of something like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I would say is that people do use drugs for reasons. That I think sometimes in the messaging that where we talk about drug harms, and there are really significant drug harms, we obscure the fact that people really do, they get some positive effects from drugs, otherwise they wouldn't use them. Every human society on the face of the planet has found a way of altering their consciousness, almost always with some sort of substance. Sometimes in remote areas of the Sahara, for example, they don't have psychedelic substances or psychoactive substances, so they develop ways of shamanic breathing and spinning around in circles until they change their consciousness. But this is a human need, it's a human desire, and people, especially people going through such significant moments in their life, like adolescents and young adults, they'll have suffering and they'll have pain. And so they'll turn to alcohol for that. So I think, in other words, I think the pragmatic first step is to really begin a compassionate inquiry into, what is this doing for you and what is the pain underneath? If it's falling asleep at night, what is that about? Really getting to the root of the problem. And that's, that's easy for me to say, but it's obviously a very deep and complicated question, and probably an individualized question. But the other thing I would say is that it's not necessarily normal, that sometimes it can feel like binging or sort of experimental drug use is sort of obligatory in social settings, and it's just not true. I think that's also part of a sort of overly romanticized narrative that we have in the States in particular. I think that's part of the legacy. That's why I wanted to show some of that history about the early alcohol epidemics in the United States, that we still have some legacies that we carry from our ancestors about the way we relate to substances, and I just the message that it's not actually necessary, that there are a lot of people who socialize and are able to connect with other people. It doesn't have to be a rite of passage. It's not necessarily like something that has to happen on prom night. It's not necessarily that you have to engage in a massive amount of binge drinking when you go off to college. And then, of course, the question becomes, then what? And then what? And then if I'm not doing that, then what? And that requires some effort and some discussion, but I think is an opportunity for exploring what truly matters to an individual. So that's only scratching the surface of a really complicated topic, but I hope that starts to get at something useful.
We're spending a lot of energy doing positive social norming campaigning, teaching students that, in fact, not as many students abuse as one might imagine. So it sounds like you are supportive of that kind of a campaign. So I'm glad to hear that. This afternoon, we're going to get into these questions, and there's some great ones here. Just really quickly, you talked about early onset and how important that is. Can you talk about that for a minute with teenagers?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Early onset?
Uh, the first experience, early experience with alcohol, about how I thought it's so interesting. You talked about a colleague who offered $100,000.
Oh, right. Yeah. This was also at the American Society of Addiction Medicine. So it's a gathering of all sorts of national leaders in healthcare and in epidemiology and survey science. And, part of the reason that places like Canada have reversed their guidelines and said that alcohol is not healthy in any amount is because of this massive epidemiological survey work. And one of the researchers who's involved in that type of work is so convinced in the power of this, and also so convinced in the effect of the age of drinking onset, that she made a sort of a wager with her children. I'll tell you what it is in a second. But basically, this research shows that essentially the later that you start drinking, the less likely you are to have problems with alcohol. And so I think that's important to say, because we have this sort of romantic notion that if we drank like Italy, or if we drank like Greece, maybe if we had like table wine and we taught kids how to interact healthfully with alcohol, then maybe they could develop good habits before they go off to college, whatever. And that's not what the science says. What the science says is that the later you start, the later that, the less likely you are to develop negative outcomes. And one of the researchers there was so convinced in this in this line of work that she told her kid, listen, if you can get to age 25 and look me in the eye and tell me that you haven't drank, then I will pay you $100,000. That's the level of confidence and importance that she attached to it. And so, I say this as someone who has a 7-year-old child. I think a lot, especially because of the deep family history of alcohol in my family. And I think about prevention all the time. And, there are things that we can say about prevention, but it seems like one of the biggest things for prevention is, just delay the onset. And I think part of what that does is it also connects to the last question that we just had, that it normalizes not drinking. It's okay to not drink. It's not a necessary part of the human fabric and the tapestry of social connection. You can go out and talk to your friends, or you can have a dinner and you can meet new people without necessarily taking the edge off. And it's good for people to learn that at any age.
And along with that, we often hear that if there's a history of problems with drinking in the family or addiction in the family, how important it is to share that information. What are your thoughts about that?
And I'm sorry, say that one more time. I keep on glancing over to the Q&As because I don't want to miss them. And then I
no, all right.
Multitasking.
What about family history and sharing that?
Yes, yeah. Family history. I think that it's complicated because, sometimes it's really painful and people have to make their own choices about what they share about their own difficult experiences. I mean, in my case, it's easy because I wrote a book and one day my kid will read it. He doesn't have any idea or any interest right now. He's 7. He's like, my dad wrote a book. There it is. You can see it. I do think that it's helpful to normalize the scope and the extent of these problems. I shared those statistics multiple times during the presentation because I think it's shocking to people who 10 to 15% of the US population have a substance use problem. My God, I thought it was something unique. I thought it was something sick and special. And really, if you have this in your family, or if you've seen it in a friend or a loved one, you're not alone. It's really much, much, much more common than what we normally take it to be. So I think it is useful. That's how I think about it. That's how I approach it. What is the intention behind the sharing? It's not a perfect inoculation against addiction, but I think it can help to communicate something about the pervasiveness and the importance of these topics.
Wonderful. Let's get to those good questions. Let's get started. Let's take that first one. Companies still make an employee redundant after they use their health benefits to seek assistance with drug addiction. It seems they're able to find loopholes to rid themselves of potential situations. Talking with addicts and recovery groups, this is a common thread. Seeking assistance as is recommended, but losing any sense of stability in doing so. Most addicts don't have the resources to fight the issue. Also, there are more pressing matters such as getting better.
Yeah. So, I'll just give my standard disclaimer, my standard boring disclaimer that I'm obligated to give, which is I can't give legal advice and I can't give medical advice, even though I work with psychiatry and the law. I can say in general that I see a lot of these issues, and it is unfortunately, I'm sorry to hear about this, Linda, and or maybe that's Erin, I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry to hear about this, but I think it is common that people can sometimes face negative consequences from sharing their histories or having them exposed in the workplace. You have to be really careful about those types of things. Generally, substance use problems are protected as a disability under American law. But we all know in practice, when the rubber hits the road, sometimes companies find little tricks and it's not a perfect installation. I can say that, there's more legal activity. I'm involved in some of the policy making of the American Psychiatric Association, and we see more top-down efforts to try to encourage compassionate approaches. But I always tell my patients in general, you can't unring that bell once you've rung it. So it's important to be careful about protecting your confidentiality as much as possible.
Thank you for that question and answer. Does categorizing addiction as a disease negate any sense of responsibility on the part of the addicted person?
Yeah, that's such a big topic, and it's an important one because, I had to write a whole book to get into this theme because I think it deserves to be treated with nuance and care. The word disease was actually, there's an interesting historical tidbit that the word disease was used as an advocacy platform in mid-century, in the mid 20th century, because at that point, hospitals weren't even admitting people with alcoholism to the wards. They said, you're not welcome here. We still have that language today of disease. So it strikes me as a little odd as somebody in recovery, because, we don't call obsessive compulsive disorder a disorder, we call it a disease. And, major depressive disorder is a disorder. So why is addiction or other substance use problems a disease? And we even have some psychological evidence that labeling something in those stark physiological terms like disease actually has costs and benefits. It's a double-edged sword, that maybe it promotes a little compassion, and maybe that has to do with the heterogeneity and how individuals respond to this messaging. But it also can increase other types of stigma and social distancing. So I tend to shy away from the word disease. But I think the real question is about responsibility. My experience and the experience of many people with addiction is that there is something about responsibility there. I mean, there's actually a philosopher at Hopkins, Hannah Pickard, who has a whole line of discussion about responsibility without blame. So for me as a person in recovery, I can take responsibility for my actions in circumstances and to the extent that it makes sense and is helpful, without necessarily adopting that as some sort of shameful story, like I'm sick and broken or I'm a bad person. And that's a very thin line to walk. I think it's best done with help. I think this is what fellowships like Alcoholics Anonymous kind of hit upon naturalistically when they talk about amends and making amends and recognizing the wreckage of the past and cleaning house. And so that's something that people organically kind of hit upon doing with a sponsor and a trusted advisor. People do work like that with psychotherapists or with coaches or with whatever. I think the key is just to not try to just do it yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for sharing your struggles and recovery so openly and candidly. Did your recovery program include a residential period? Did you put your work, clinical, academic on hold for a time as well? Wishing you good luck.
Thank you. Yes, I went to a residential treatment center. It was longer than the traditional 28 days because that's the way the state of New York treats it. That I actually, it was part of that sort of wavering denial I felt in the early days. And I think this is one of the things that is really challenging about severe cases of substance use problems, where I was in the hospital and I said, I think I'm an alcoholic, like my parents were, I really need help. And they said, oh, you should refer yourself to this organization that helps doctors with problems, and I did that, and I said, please, I want to enroll in your program, please help me. And they said, okay, well, you should go to this program. And I said, oh, that sounds long. I don't want to do that anymore. And not to be flip about it, but I mean, I think it's important to laugh about the ways that our minds can play tricks on us. And there are ways that it wasn't like I passed out of one state of denial into acceptance. There was a sort of interplay back and forth, and so that's where I experienced some resistance. And it was really, really helpful for me in my case, ultimately, even though it did have some problems with confrontation and some people who I think were kind of operating in an old school mentality. It was really powerful for me in the end, and just in terms of being part of the community and meeting other people, and having the time and the space to connect with other people and see that I wasn't alone. That's really what helped me the most.
There's a question about some of the trends, and you alluded that this afternoon about the contamination that you're seeing. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So fentanyl is a lot in the news. A lot of folks probably know, but it bears saying that fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is extremely potent, much more powerful than heroin, and because it's potent, it's easier to smuggle. And that's an iron law of drug policy, that when things get tough for smugglers and dealers, then they go to more potent substances. And so this is what's happening, is that we have a poison drug supply. It's not just fentanyl. It's also xylazine, which is essentially primarily a veterinary tranquilizer, which is now being used to cut certain types of, not just heroin in bags, but just counterfeit pills that can be sort of pressed and handed out at parties. And I say that not to say that we should all be like using scare tactics with our kids or otherwise. I don't think that works necessarily, but just to be aware that it can be really dangerous to go to illicit drug supplies. That it's really just it's an issue of poisoning more than anything else, and we have to treat the drug supply as if it's poisoned. And God forbid, but if somebody is in a chronic drug problem where they have trouble stopping on their own, then we consider more official, formal medical treatments and ways of reducing the harm so that they're less likely to die of overdose. But this can happen. People in New York City who have access to supposedly very pure and fancy illicit drugs have experienced cocaine contaminated with fentanyl, and wind up overdosing. So it's not something to be treated blithely. It's not something that just happens over there with so-called hardcore addicts. It's a problem that unfortunately is increasingly in the whole illicit drug supply.
Thank you. That seems so important. The family of an addict that is new to the field of recovery is often surprised at the depth of work that needs undertaking for the addict. Often the focus on the addict's recovery overshadows the importance of the family's awareness of best practices to support the addict going forward and assistance for their thoughts and emotions that have been dismissed. Alcohol and substance use is accepted as adolescent rite of passage, and we shrug it off. Even making light of this practice starts the ball rolling in the young mind that it is fun and overly harmful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are some. Yeah, thank you, Erin. These are some important points, and I see in the Q&A box you also asked about step work and recovery, and I think that's a really important and developing topic. That's something that again, science is catching up to. I think we're very good at studying problems, but increasingly and more recently, people are studying recovery and studying the things that, again, I think that fellowship groups like Alcoholics Anonymous have hit upon organically and naturally, that there's a big difference between getting sober and staying sober. And I think that's true with people with mild to moderate problems too, that there's a lot more beyond cessation of use, that they're, again, people use drugs for reasons. And so if they were using it because of social anxiety, or if they were using it because they had some sort of inherent tendency toward impulsive activity, or who knows why, the why often doesn't even matter. that much. It's not about coming to some, and this is not to knock Freud, because I think, Freudian psychotherapy has its uses, but in the case of a lot of addiction treatment, it's not about untangling some sort of story about how we wound up or why we wound up the way we did. It's more about just pragmatically looking at, what is a flourishing life? What does it mean to be in true connection with other people? What is my true and authentic set of values that I want to be working toward? And what does working a program of recovery look like for me? And I have tremendous respect for AA and 12 steps. I've seen a lot of people do really well with that. There are also people who seek recovery or work on their substance use problems primarily through a medical channel. There are people who do it primarily through a spiritual channel that's not 12 steps. There are alternatives to 12-step models for people who just feel a different fit. There's a lot out there. There really is a lot out there. And the key message that I want to share is that there are many different pathways. There are many different pathways to change. And the key is to try and to show up and to seek appropriate help when it's necessary.
We're winding down here. I want to take this question. I just took my spouse to the ER 9 days ago due to alcohol abuse. He's in detox for the first time. What can we expect from here, and how can we best support him?
Faye, I'm so sorry to hear about that, and thank you for sharing. I know it's a powerful experience. I'm just thinking back because I just shared about it to my own experience, getting that kind of medical help for the first time, and I can know it can be a real shock. And I say that to say, it can sound cliched, but it's true that the first step is really self-care and putting on your own oxygen mask. I think it's easy in crisis mode to get into a mode of looking outward and thinking about what I should be doing and so forth. But really, you're of no use to people if you burn out or if you're not doing well. So really, like, taking a step back and making sure that you, and again, not to give medical advice or to give you any advice, but just to say in general that this is a key. This is always chapter 1 in all the how to help your spouse books about substance use problems, because it matters. But then you were asking about how can we best support him. And I don't know, there's a lot of diversity in substance use treatments and facilities and professionals. And, what I would say about that is that in the big picture, taking your question as broadly as possible, what can we expect from here? I think that a lot of people have this notion that substance use problems are a death sentence, that people, are, irrevocably sick or broken, and the prognosis is very bad, and it's probably worse than other mental problems. And it's just not true. Most people with substance problems recover. And most people who work at it achieve some real profound lifelong changes. Many, many people in recovery, myself included, say, I wouldn't wish that on myself or on anybody else again, but I'm really grateful for those experiences because they pointed me toward the suffering and the pain that was present in my life that I had to work on. So, once people start to, here's one statistic that might be helpful. Once people start to make an effort toward change, it can sometimes take a long time to achieve sustained long-term abstinence. Sometimes it can take 5 years or more. But most of those days are abstinent days on average, once you look over the long term. And in the end, way more than 50% get better. So the sort of common stereotype of how rough a road this will be is just not necessarily true. It doesn't have to be true for everyone. So I would just say, in general, to everyone, that if you're having problems and you're looking for help, there are a lot of different resources. There are a lot of different pathways to change, and the key point is to educate yourself, look into the diversity of things, trust yourself, and know that, if something is not working, that there are other options available. The key is just to try and to stick with it, because there's a lot of hope there.
It's a good note to end on, Doctor. It's been a pleasure spending the day with you. Lots of applause coming. It's such a hopeful way of looking at this issue, and you discussed it with us tonight with such honesty and wisdom, and I'm very grateful. And I think a lot of people are going to go by the urge, and I think we'll all enjoy it together. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with you again. And this is where we go hug the kids. So we'll go do that right now. Thank you, Doctor. Have a great
Thanks for
evening.
having me, and thank you everyone for coming to talk about this important topic. I really appreciate it.
Really appreciate you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening. Take care.